Mrs. Janet Crawford lunged toward Piper Blackwell's desk. Her eyes narrowed like blades, and her fingers were already poised to seize the denim jacket on the child's shoulders. Her mouth ground out each word as she snarled that Piper was to take that filthy thing off immediately. A jacket that smelled like the slums had no place in her classroom. Before Piper could even lift her hands to protect it, the teacher had already grabbed the collar and yanked. The stitching her mother had repaired 3 times with cracked hands tore apart in front of 30 children frozen in fear. Then Crawford flung the jacket into the trash as if it were nothing more than a garbage fag. She turned back with a victorious glare and roared that if Piper's parents could not afford decent clothes, then they should not bring trash into her classroom, asking whether Piper wanted the whole class to smell her family's poverty. Piper stood up terrifyingly calm. She walked to the trash can, lifted the jacket out, folded it neatly, and placed it in her backpack. Looking straight at Crawford, she said only that the teacher had no right to touch her belongings. Then Crawford's hand swung. The sound of the slap cracked through the dead silence of the classroom as the left cheek of the 10-year-old burned red. Yet Crawford still did not stop. She marched back to her desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a pair of scissors. The steel blades flashed under the fluorescent light. She stormed back, ripped the jacket from Piper's bag, and cut a long slash from shoulder to hem. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the room like breaking bone. The careful seams Elise Dawson, Piper's mother, had stitched over many nights under dim light inside an old Honda Civic during a freezing Chicago winter, using blue thread because she had none to match, now lay motionless on the classroom floor like a piece of memory severed. The $3 jacket from Goodwill that a single mother once wrapped around her daughter every night when they had no home, no bed, nothing but each other, now lying in 2 pieces at the feet of a 48-year-old woman who smiled as she declared that now it truly was trash. And the entire class gaped, Wyatt Jen's hands shaking as he kept recording on his phone hidden beneath the desk. Zoe Martinez standing to protest only to be shouted down at once. Yet Piper did not scream, did not cry, did not tremble. She simply bent down, picked up both pieces of the jacket, folded them carefully as if they were still whole, and placed them back into her backpack. Her jaw clenched, her eyes dry, her breathing steady, because 10 years of life. From 4 months sleeping in a car to days when her mother skipped meals so her child could eat. From learning at 5 years old to master the art of silence so she would not add to the invisible burdens her mother carried had taught her one thing most 10-year-olds should never have to learn. Never let them see you break. But what Crawford did not see, what she had never bothered to understand, was the small hand beneath the desk, pressing a button on a nondescript black band that resembled a cheap plastic toy watch, a custom-engineered device hidden beneath her sleeve, triggering a pre-programmed silent alarm that connected directly to a man whose love for his daughter was matched only by his capacity for calculated distraction. A man who grew up orphaned in the rough streets of Chicago and swore no one would ever touch his family. And when the watch vibrated softly with a single line that read, "Do not be afraid. Your dad is coming," the carefully constructed world Janet Crawford had built over 14 years of teaching began counting down to collapse because she had just raised her hand and scissors against the most sacred keepsake of the Piper Blackwell family. A man whose true nature most of the city never suspected, a reclusive titan who commanded a legitimate empire while his real power remained hidden in the shadows. And he had never, not once, forgiven anyone who dared harm his family. At that exact second, the encrypted phone inside Piper Blackwell's breast pocket vibrated with 3 short bursts. He was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise, presiding over a $50 million syndicate negotiation. The air in the room was thick with tension, smoke hanging low as rival bosses argued over shipping ports. Kieran slipped the device out, his face completely emptied of any human emotion as he looked at the screen. A crimson code red alert blinked back at him, pinpointing his daughter inside the medical wing of her elite academy. He tapped his screen once, sending a silent vibration back to the cheap plastic watch in the classroom that read, "Do not be afraid. Your dad is coming." Then Kieran stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket with 2 fingers, his movements deliberate and terrifyingly quiet. He walked out of the heavy double doors without offering a single word of explanation. The top captains of the Chicago underworld sat frozen in stunned silence, instinctively understanding that whatever had just happened was far more dangerous than anything discussed at that table. The black SUV tore through the city streets, disregarding traffic lights and speed limits until it screeched to a halt outside the wrought iron gates of the elite academy. Kieran stepped out into the biting wind, ignoring the $70,000 a year price tag attached to the manicured lawns and brick facades. He walked through the main entrance with a focused, predatory calm that made the security guards step back and swallow their questions. He did not ask for directions or wait for a visitor pass. His heavy footsteps echoed down the pristine hallways until he reached the frosted glass door of the medical room. He pushed it open and stopped. There sat Piper on a small examination bed with her feet dangling above the floor. She was holding the 2 severed pieces of the denim jacket in her lap, meticulously trying to align the torn edges. A pale purple bruise was already blossoming across her left cheek, stark and violent against her fair skin. The school nurse stood nervously in the corner, but Kieran did not even acknowledge her existence. He walked forward and knelt on the cold linoleum, bringing his eyes level with his daughter. Piper looked up from the ruined fabric, her face still wearing that terrifyingly blank mask she had learned years ago. She did not cry or reach for him, but simply stated that her teacher had cut her mother's jacket. Kieran felt a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated violence claw at his throat, begging to be unleashed upon the building. He wanted to burn the school to its foundations and bury the women responsible in the ashes. But he looked at the swelling mark on his child's face and forced the monster back into its cage. Piper did not need the Mafia boss of Chicago right now. She needed her father. Kieran reached out with steady, gentle hands, carefully lifting the ruined jacket from her lap before scooping her into his arms. He pressed her head against his shoulder, whispering that she was safe and that they were going home. He carried her out of the medical room, his gaze fixed straight ahead, radiating a silent promise of absolute ruin to anyone who dared cross their path. Once he settled Piper into the reinforced back seat of the SUV, he closed the heavy door and stepped away for just a moment. He pulled out his phone and made a single, quiet call. The line connected instantly, and Kieran spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Bring Finn, Reed, and Jace to the estate immediately. Someone touched my daughter." To understand why the destruction of a $3 jacket brought the most feared man in Chicago to his knees, you have to understand the woman who sewed it. Elise Dawson was 28 years old, and she wore her tragic past not as a burden, but as impenetrable armor. She grew up in the kind of crushing poverty that makes people entirely invisible to the rest of the world. She was abandoned by a father who drank his paychecks and a mother who simply walked out one frozen morning without a single word. By the time Elise was 21, she found herself completely alone in the world, holding a newborn baby girl in a sterile, uncaring county hospital room. And she was drowning beneath $300,000 in compounded medical and survival debt. The vicious collection letters piled up until she lost her tiny rented apartment, and she was forced to carry her daughter into the unforgiving streets of the city. She swore she would never abandon her child the way she had been abandoned by her own blood, and she kept that desperate promise with every breath in her lungs. That winter was the coldest and most brutal season Chicago had seen in a decade. Elise and baby Piper lived inside an old rusted Honda Civic parked beneath the flickering amber light of an abandoned strip mall. The car heater was completely broken, and the windows frosted over with thick, suffocating layers of ice every single night. Elise worked 3 grueling jobs, scrubbing diner floors and washing dishes until her hands were cracked raw and bleeding, just to buy enough baby formula for the week. On a bitter January evening, she found a massive adult denim jacket hanging in the back of a local Goodwill for exactly $3. She brought it back to the freezing car and used a dull needle and mismatched blue thread to alter it under the dim glow of the dome light. She pushed the needle through the thick, unforgiving fabric, pricking her fingers over and over until dark blood stained the seams, but she did not stop. She sewed the fabric tightly together, wrapping the oversized coat around her tiny daughter like a fortress against the killing cold. That jacket was never just a piece of clothing, but a physical, undeniable manifestation of a mother's desperate will to keep her child alive. Years passed in a blur of exhaustion, but the relentless struggle for survival did not yield. Elise was working a late-night shift at a greasy diner on the violent south side of the city when the back door crashed open. She walked into the darkened alley to take out the trash, and her foot struck something warm and wet on the freezing concrete. A man in a tailored black suit was slumped against the brick wall, bleeding heavily from 2 bullet wounds in his shoulder and side. His face was ghostly pale, his breath rattling violently in his chest, and anyone else would have run away screaming for the police. But Elise had lived her entire life in the dangerous shadows, and panic was a luxury she could simply not afford. She grabbed the wounded man by his collar, dragging his heavy frame through the service door and into the dimly lit employee break room. She tore his expensive shirt open, poured cheap burning vodka over his open wounds, and pressed clean bar towels tightly against the bleeding flesh. She did not ask his name or who had shot him, because in her gritty world, asking questions only got you killed. She simply sat beside him for 20 agonizing minutes, holding the towels with her scarred hands until his heavily armed men finally arrived to extract him from the diner. 3 days later, a thick manila envelope was quietly slipped under the door of Elise's cramped rental room. Inside was exactly $100,000 in crisp, untraceable bills and a blank white business card bearing a single phone number. It was more money than Elise had ever seen in her entire life, enough to wipe out her crushing debt and buy a safe, comfortable life for Piper. But she looked at the stacks of cash, her jaw tightening with the fierce, unbroken pride of a woman who had never taken a handout from anyone. That night, she walked through the rain and dialed the number from a rusted payphone outside the diner. When the deep, cold voice answered on the other end, she told Piper Blackwell exactly who she was and that she did not want his dirty mafia money. She told him that she saved his life because he was dying on the concrete, not because she was looking for a massive payout. Piper was stunned into absolute silence. A dangerous man accustomed to buying loyalty and fear, suddenly faced with a poor waitress who could not be bought. He asked her what she needed, and Elise demanded only one thing with unwavering strength. She asked for premium health insurance for her sick daughter, nothing more, and then she slammed the phone down. Piper Blackwell could not stop thinking about the defiant woman with the cracked hands and the unbreakable spirit. He began visiting the diner every week, sitting quietly in the dark corner booth just to watch her work with that relentless, quiet dignity. He saw in Elise the exact same orphaned, street-hardened survivor he had been, and he slowly dismantled his own icy defenses to earn her elusive trust. It took months of incredible patience, but the ruthless mafia boss eventually fell deeply in love with the struggling mother, and he swore his life and his empire to protecting her and her daughter. He adopted Piper legally, bringing Elise and the little girl into his impenetrable, fiercely guarded world of absolute safety and unimaginable wealth. Yet despite the millions of dollars at her disposal, Piper still wore that faded, mismatched $3 denim jacket to her elite academy every single day. It carried the faint scent of her mother's survival, the haunting memory of those freezing nights in the Honda Civic, and the ultimate symbol of the fierce love that kept them alive. So when Janet Crawford took her sharp scissors and sliced that beautiful jacket in half, she did not merely destroy a piece of cheap, dirty fabric. She drove a blade directly through the sacred history of the Blackwell family, and she awakened a lethal monster that would not rest until her entire world burned to ashes. The underground server room of the Blackwell estate hummed with the quiet, terrifying energy of a digital war room. Reed sat before 6 glowing monitors with his fingers flying across the keyboard at a blinding speed. He was the brilliant architect of Karen's information network, and the elite corporate firewalls of the $70,000 a year academy posed absolutely no challenge to his skills. He breached their encrypted servers in less than 14 minutes, effortlessly slipping past their expensive digital security. He began stripping away the pristine public image of the school to expose the rotting core hidden deep beneath the surface. He did not find a chaotic record of a teacher losing her temper in a single moment of madness. What he uncovered was far more sinister and meticulously organized. Janet Crawford was not an unhinged woman making a tragic, isolated mistake. She was a highly calculated enforcer of the Academy's wealthy brand, operating with the cold precision of a systemic predator. She deliberately targeted the vulnerable, and she documented her psychological warfare in neatly categorized folders on the school's private network. Reed opened files containing 15 different names, all belonging to innocent children from low-income families who had received scholarships over the past 5 years. He read internal performance reports that Crawford had manually altered to ensure these exceptionally bright children failed their classes. He found security footage she had archived of herself isolating these students in the dark corners of her classroom, turning them into pariahs for the simple crime of being poor. She systematically humiliated them for their worn shoes and their discounted lunches until their young spirits broke completely. Then she recommended their immediate removal from the academy to protect the flawless institutional prestige. She kept their confiscated plastic hair clips and cheat-cloth dolls locked in a classroom cabinet like twisted, silent hunting trophies. And the most horrifying realization was that she did not do this in secret or in the shadows. She operated in the broad daylight of the Academy's wealthy corridors because she knew she was completely protected by the people at the very top. The digital trail led directly to the private inbox of the school principal and a powerful coalition of 5 billionaire board members. Reed pulled up dozens of email threads where Crawford openly complained about the scholarship children staining the immaculate image of their elite institution. The principal replied to every single complaint with the exact same chilling instruction to handle the problem however she saw fit. When the desperate parents of those 15 broken children tried to speak out, the 5 board members crushed them without a single ounce of mercy. They unleashed armies of expensive corporate lawyers, burying the impoverished families in insurmountable legal threats and forcing them to sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. They paid off the terrified parents with financial scraps and legally bound them to silence, forever under the threat of complete ruin. The board members treated the systemic abuse of children as a simple public relations vulnerability that required aggressive corporate risk management. They built an impenetrable fortress of wealth and legal loopholes around Janet Crawford, ensuring no one from the outside world could ever touch her. Reed dug deeper into the financial records of the 5 billionaire board members to understand their twisted, arrogant motivations. He discovered that the Academy was not just a place of learning, but a highly lucrative networking hub for Chicago's absolute elite. The board members used the pristine reputation of the school to secure massive real estate deals and expand their own political influence. The presence of struggling, working-class children threatened the exclusive, country club atmosphere they actively sold to their wealthy investors. Janet Crawford was simply their willing executioner, the vicious guard dog hard to keep the unwashed masses outside their gilded gates. The principal acted as the eager middleman, shielding the board from direct liability while collecting massive annual bonuses for maintaining the wealthy status quo. They had weaponized their immense wealth to build a ruthless system where the poor had no voice, no rights, and absolutely no chance of survival. And they slept perfectly soundly at night, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just dragged a true apex predator into their carefully manicured yard. Reed printed the massive 200-page dossier and laid it silently on the heavy oak desk in Karen's private study. The Mafia boss stood in the absolute silence of the room, reading every single page under the harsh glare of a single desk lamp. He looked at the photographs of the confiscated cheap toys and read the ruthless legal threats sent to 15 helpless mothers and fathers. The silence in the room grew suffocating as the brutal reality of the systemic abuse settled over the hardened crime lord. He thought about his own daughter, Piper, holding the torn pieces of her mother's jacket with dry eyes and a broken heart. He thought about the 15 other children who went home crying, carrying invisible wounds that no amount of time could easily erase. His jaw clenched tight enough to crack bone as the icy rage in his chest evolved into something much colder and far more destructive. Kieran knew that shedding blood would be the easiest and fastest way to end this, but physical violence was a mercy these people did not deserve. A simple, violent hit on Janet Crawford in a dark alley would no longer suffice to balance the scales of justice. Killing her would only allow the corrupt institution to cover up the mess, replace her, and continue feeding on the vulnerable children of the city. Kieran realized he could not just remove a single bad branch from a deeply poisonous tree. He had to tear the entire academy out by its roots and burn the toxic soil so nothing could ever grow there again. He looked up at Reed, his dark eyes entirely devoid of warmth, and issued his final, chilling command. There would be no broken bones and no bullets fired in the dark. They would systematically strip away every layer of protection, every dollar of wealth, and every shred of dignity these elitists possessed until they begged for an end. He closed the thick folder with a quiet, definitive snap and ordered his lieutenant to prepare the syndicate for a total, systemic annihilation of their impenetrable world. Janet Crawford drove back to her affluent suburban home with a cold, triumphant smile resting on her face. She had just finished a private meeting with the academy principal in his lavish office. He had poured her a glass of expensive bourbon and assured her that the Blackwell family was nothing more than a minor annoyance. The school board had already unleashed their corporate lawyers, and the poor girl would be quietly expelled by the end of the week. Crawford pulled her pristine white sedan into the driveway and activated the state-of-the-art security system. She believed she was completely untouchable inside her fortress of modern technology and wealthy connections. She walked through the heavy oak front door and punched her code into the alarm keypad. The green light blinked, confirming that her pristine, heavily guarded world was perfectly secure. She poured herself a glass of wine and walked upstairs to her master bedroom, completely unaware that a ghost had already breached her walls. Jace was Karen Blackwell's premier infiltration expert, and a civilian home security system was nothing but a child's toy to him. He had bypassed the digital locks and motion sensors hours ago, without leaving a single microscopic trace of his presence. Crawford pushed open her heavy bedroom door and reached for the light switch, but her hand froze in midair. Lying in the exact center of her perfectly made bed were the 2 severed pieces of Piper's denim jacket. They had been meticulously washed, pressed, and aligned so perfectly that the cut looked like a single, terrifying scar. Crawford dropped her wine glass on the hardwood floor, the red liquid shattering and pooling like fresh blood around her expensive shoes. Beside the ruined fabric lay a sleek black USB drive and a crisp piece of white paper. Her trembling hands reached out to pick up the note, and she read the meticulously handwritten words. The black ink spelled out a chilling, simple message that read, "This is 10% of what we have." A suffocating wave of pure terror crashed over Crawford as she realized someone had stood beside the very bed where she slept. She spun around wildly, checking the reinforced windows and the heavy deadbolts, but everything was perfectly locked from the inside. There were no broken glass panes, no muddy footprints on the rug, and absolutely no signs of a forced entry. She ran downstairs in a blind panic, intending to flee the house, but she stopped dead in her tracks in the kitchen. She looked out the bay window and realized her white sedan was entirely missing from the driveway. She whipped her head toward the wooden key rack on the wall, and her breath caught violently in her throat. Her car keys were hanging on their exact designated hook, completely untouched. She sprinted to the front door and looked frantically down the dark, affluent street. She spotted her vehicle parked neatly against the curb 3 blocks away, perfectly intact and completely locked. The chilling realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, driving her to her knees on the cold marble floor. The invisible intruders were sending a perfectly clear and utterly terrifying message without uttering a single word. They could bypass her expensive security, enter her most intimate spaces, and take whatever they wanted at any given moment. They moved her car just to prove that they controlled every single aspect of her heavily guarded reality. Crawford scrambled back inside and locked the door, but the locks suddenly felt like useless pieces of fragile plastic. She pulled out her phone to call the police, but her thumb hovered over the screen and began to shake uncontrollably. She realized that calling the authorities would achieve absolutely nothing against phantoms who left no evidence behind. Janet Crawford curled into a tight ball on her living room floor, clutching her ringing ears in the suffocating silence. The arrogant, untouchable teacher finally understood that she was entirely at the mercy of an omnipotent, invisible force that was just beginning to play with its prey. Kieran was orchestrating a digital slaughter from the shadows, but Elise refused to simply sit in the penthouse and wait. She walked into the server room and took the thick folder containing the 15 names directly from Reed's desk. She knew exactly what it felt like to be crushed by people with money and power, and she knew these families would never trust a man in a tailored suit. They needed someone who spoke the language of survival, someone who carried the same invisible scars of poverty. She ordered her heavy security detail to stay in the cars, choosing to walk up to these broken-down apartment doors completely alone. The first address belonged to a single mother named Maria, who worked 2 grueling cleaning jobs just to keep the lights on. Maria opened her peeling door with terrified, exhausted eyes, instantly recognizing the rigid posture of someone bringing bad news from the elite academy. Elise did not offer her a fake smile or empty corporate apologies, but simply asked for a few minutes of her time. Maria sat at a small kitchen table clutching a worn dish towel, her voice trembling as she spoke about the expensive non-disclosure agreement. The wealthy school board had threatened to ruin her life and sue her for hundreds of thousands of dollars if she ever spoke about how Janet Crawford had tormented her little boy. She wept as she described her son coming home with his spirit completely broken, convinced he was nothing but worthless trash because his shoes were bought secondhand. Elise listened in absolute silence as the familiar, suffocating weight of systemic poverty filled the cramped room. Then she reached across the table and placed her scarred hands gently over Maria's trembling fingers. She spoke in a low, steady voice, telling the terrified mother about the freezing nights she had spent sleeping in a rusted Honda Civic with a newborn baby. She told her about washing dishes for 14 hours a day and sewing a $3 jacket until her fingers bled just to keep her daughter alive. The shock in Maria's eyes slowly transformed into a deep, desperate recognition as she realized the wealthy woman sitting before her was a true survivor of the exact same gutters. Elise did not stop with Maria, but spent the next 3 days relentlessly visiting every single name on the horrific list. She walked into cramped, dimly lit living rooms and sat on worn-out sofas with 15 different families who had been systematically silenced by the billionaire board members. She met a proud father who had swallowed his dignity to protect his daughter from legal ruin, and she met exhausted grandparents raising orphan children on meager Social Security checks. every single family carried the exact same paralyzing fear of the elite academy and their massive army of ruthless corporate lawyers. But Elise broke through their terror with her raw, unfiltered empathy and the undeniable truth of her own brutal past. She looked into their exhausted eyes and promised them that the dark days of bowing to arrogant billionaires were officially over. She swore on her daughter's life that the Blackwell Syndicate would provide them with absolute, unlimited financial and legal protection against any retaliation. Elise explained that the powerful people at the academy operated on the arrogant assumption that the poor would always remain isolated and powerless. She told them that a single broken voice could easily be silenced with a lawsuit, but 15 united families backed by endless resources would create an unstoppable tidal wave. She offered them a chance to finally fight back, not just for their own traumatized children, but to ensure Janet Crawford could never shatter another innocent soul again. One by one, the heavy, suffocating chains of fear began to snap inside those small, dimly lit rooms. The desperate parents looked at the fierce, unwavering conviction burning in Elise's eyes, and they found a courage they thought had been beaten out of them long ago. They signed their names to sworn affidavits, effectively turning 15 isolated, broken victims into a highly weaponized, united coalition. Elise Dawson walked out of the final apartment building and looked up at the cold Chicago sky, knowing she had just forged the exact army her husband needed to burn the corrupt academy to the ground. The 5 billionaire board members and the academy principal gathered in a sleek, glass-walled conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline. They had just hired the most ruthless, expensive crisis management firm in the city to handle the minor inconvenience of Piper Blackwell. The public relations executives swiftly drafted a highly polished, utterly sickening press release. They framed the brutal physical assault on a 10-year-old child as a simple, mutual misunderstanding regarding the strict institutional dress code. They planned to completely bury the credibility of the Blackwell family while painting Janet Crawford as an overworked but fiercely dedicated educator. The arrogant men sipped their expensive scotch and congratulated themselves on neutralizing yet another annoying threat with their endless wealth. Their fabricated, lying press release was scheduled to go live to every major media outlet in exactly 10 minutes. Across the city, Kieran Blackwell stood silently in his underground server room beside his master hacker. He watched a digital timer count down on 6 glowing monitors with eyes as cold as black ice. He knew exactly what the wealthy board was attempting to do, and he had absolutely no intention of letting them control the narrative. Kieran did not fight his wars with high-priced lawyers or crafted public relations statements. He fought with total, overwhelming, and undeniable destruction. He looked at Reed and gave him a single, silent nod. Reed let his fingers fly across the keyboard, executing a devastating command that bypassed the Academy corporate firewalls like they were made of thin paper. The digital guillotine was officially released into the world, and there was absolutely no turning back for the people who had hurt his daughter. The synchronized digital strike hit the city of Chicago like a massive, invisible shockwave. Millions of encrypted emails instantly bypassed every spam filter and landed simultaneously in the primary inboxes of every enrolled parent, institutional investor, and national news network. The massive data dump opened with the fully restored, high-definition security footage of Janet Crawford viciously tearing the beloved denim jacket and slapping Piper across the face. But the Mafia boss did not stop with just one single piece of damning evidence. The leak included the 15 deeply hidden complaint files from the impoverished families, fully documented with their heartbreaking, ignored testimonies. It also broadcasted every single complicit, arrogant email the principal had ever sent. The entire world could now read his explicit orders telling Crawford to handle the poor, unwanted children however she saw fit. The carefully cultivated, pristine image of the elite academy shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. The arrogant board members were still holding their crystal scotch glasses when their private phones began ringing simultaneously in a deafening, terrifying chorus of panic. News anchors across the city interrupted their regular evening broadcasts to show the horrific classroom footage to millions of utterly horrified viewers. Outraged parents immediately flooded the school switchboards, screaming for answers and violently pulling their wealthy children from the corrupted institution. Social media platforms exploded with pure, unadulterated fury as the undeniable proof of systemic, elitist abuse spread like wildfire. In less than a single hour, the impenetrable fortress of wealth and privilege collapsed into absolute, burning ruin. The board members finally realized that no amount of money could ever hide their sins when the king of the underworld decided to drag them into the blinding light. The 5 billionaire board members refused to go down quietly. They were men accustomed to bending the world to their will. They gathered in a smoke-filled private club and pooled their vast resources. They hired a ruthless private military contracting firm to handle the situation. They wanted to dig up dirt on the Blackwell family and intimidate the relentless media networks. They believed their endless money could easily bury this public relations disaster. They assumed Karen was just another angry parent with a loud voice. They had no idea they had just declared war on the absolute king of the Chicago underworld. And Karen Blackwell was already moving his pieces across the board. Kieran did not respond with bullets or street violence. He understood that billionaires only bled when you cut into their bank accounts. He directed his financial operators to target the board members' heavily guarded offshore shell companies. He moved through the darkest corners of the global banking system with terrifying speed. In a single afternoon, he quietly bought out $50 million of their hidden, toxic debts. He gathered their financial secrets and locked them inside his own impenetrable vault. He now held the absolute power to trigger their immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. He had them completely surrounded without ever firing a single shot. The elite private military contractors began their investigation into the Blackwell syndicate. They dug into the shadows and quickly realized exactly who they were dealing with. The mercenaries discovered the sheer, lethal magnitude of Karen's empire. They understood that no amount of corporate money was worth crossing an apex predator. The contractors immediately dropped the lucrative assignment and retreated in sheer terror. They left the arrogant board members completely defenseless against the incoming slaughter. Kieran then sent a single, heavily encrypted message to the private phones of the 5 billionaires. He outlined their massive hidden debts and promised them total federal exposure if they did not surrender by midnight. The billionaires stared at their screens in suffocating horror. They realized their pristine lives were hanging by a single, fragile thread. They scrambled to save themselves from total financial annihilation. The very next morning, the 5 board members and the academy principal abruptly resigned in utter, humiliating public disgrace. They released pathetic statements citing personal reasons, but the entire city knew the truth. They abandoned the sinking ship of the academy to save their own remaining wealth. The massive institutional shield that had protected Janet Crawford for 5 years completely evaporated overnight. She was no longer a protected enforcer of the elite. She was now just an exposed, terrified woman standing completely alone in the path of a devastating storm. The morning after the digital leak, Janet Crawford woke up to a world that completely despised her. Every national news network was broadcasting her face on a continuous, inescapable loop. She watched the footage of herself slapping Piper Blackwell and felt a cold knot of dread twist deep inside her stomach. She immediately reached for her phone to call the powerful teachers' union that had protected her for 14 years. She expected them to assign a ruthless lawyer to defend her pristine reputation. But the senior representative on the other end of the line spoke with a voice like cracked ice. He informed her that the union was officially and permanently dropping her case. He cited the irrefutable, high-definition video evidence and the 15 sworn affidavits from the abused families. He told her she was a massive liability to their organization and immediately hung up the phone. Crawford stared at the dead screen in absolute shock as her first major pillar of protection crumbled into dust. She was no longer a respected, elite educator holding power over the vulnerable. She was a national pariah stripped of every institutional shield she had ever relied upon. Her husband of 20 years sat at the kitchen table with his packed suitcases resting by the front door. He was a quiet, unassuming accountant who had always turned a blind eye to her arrogant elitism. But he had watched the viral video a dozen times throughout the sleepless night. He had seen the gleeful, terrifying cruelty in his wife's eyes as she sliced a child's jacket in half. He did not yell or throw things or demand any sort of desperate explanation. He simply looked at Crawford with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust that cut deeper than any screaming match. He told her he did not recognize the monstrous woman standing in his kitchen. He quietly picked up his bags and walked out the heavy oak door without ever looking back. The sound of his car engine fading down the affluent suburban street echoed like a death knell in the silent house. Crawford ran to the window and watched her final tether to a normal life completely disappear. She had spent 5 years deliberately tearing impoverished families apart, and now her own family was entirely obliterated. The sprawling, heavily secured suburban house suddenly felt like a massive, suffocating tomb. Crawford locked every single door and drew the heavy curtains tightly shut against the glaring afternoon sun. She turned off all the lights because she was terrified that someone was watching her from the street. She curled up on the expensive living room sofa and clutched her old tabby cat tightly against her chest. The silence of the empty house was deafening, broken only by the loud, frantic beating of her own heart. Every creaking floorboard and every rustling branch outside made her entire body flinch in sheer terror. She remembered the severed jacket mysteriously appearing on her pillow and the invisible phantoms moving her car. She knew the Blackwell syndicate could bypass her expensive locks whenever they pleased. She was completely trapped inside a gilded cage of her own making, utterly defenseless against an omnipotent enemy. For the first time in her arrogant life, she felt the exact same paralyzing helplessness she had inflicted on 15 innocent children. She was a small, terrified creature waiting in the dark for a predator to finally strike. Crawford squeezed her eyes shut, but the faces of the scholarship students flashed vividly in her mind. She remembered forcing 9-year-old Miguel to sit completely alone in a dark corner of her classroom for 3 months. She remembered the way he had curled into himself, trying desperately to become invisible under her cruel, judging gaze. Now she was the one curled into a tight, trembling ball in the darkest corner of her living room. She remembered failing Su Yen Park and mocking her impoverished parents while the little girl silently wept at her desk. Now Crawford was the one weeping uncontrollably, stripped of her career and her dignity and her entire life's work. The poetic, agonizing justice of her situation crashed over her like a suffocating wave of freezing water. Kieran Blackwell had not broken a single bone in her body, yet he had completely shattered her reality. He had methodically stripped away her wealth, her protection, her marriage, and her arrogant sense of safety. He had forced her to drink the exact same toxic poison she had gleefully fed to defenseless children for half a decade. The sun finally set, casting long, terrifying shadows across the empty walls of her living room. Crawford's phone buzzed violently on the coffee table, making her scream and drop the frightened cat. She stared at the glowing screen, entirely paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating dread of what the notification might be. She had received thousands of death threats and hateful messages from strangers all over the country throughout the day. But her shattered mind convinced her this was a direct message from the invisible monsters who had ruined her life. She realized with absolute, chilling certainty that no police officer or lawyer or friend was ever coming to save her. She had built her entire existence on stepping on the weak, and now there was no one left to catch her when she fell. The psychological siege had achieved exactly what Kieran Blackwell intended from the very beginning. Janet Crawford was completely and utterly broken, reduced to a hollow, paranoid shell of the arrogant woman she had been just a week ago. She sat alone in the freezing dark, desperately waiting for the final blow to fall and end her agonizing torment. Janet Crawford had not slept in 4 days. The heavy silence of her empty suburban house was slowly driving her to the absolute brink of madness. She jumped at every shifting shadow and flinched at the sound of the wind rattling her reinforced windows. Then her phone lit up with a blinding flash on the dark coffee table. A single text message from an unknown number glowed brightly against the cracked screen. The message contained an address in the desolate industrial district of South Chicago and a chilling final instruction to come completely alone. Crawford stared at the glowing words with hollow, exhausted eyes, knowing deep in her bones that this was a summons from her invisible tormentors. She believed with absolute certainty that she was driving to her own execution. Yet the psychological torture of waiting in the dark had become infinitely worse than the prospect of death itself. She grabbed her car keys with trembling hands and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. She was ready to finally face the monster who had methodically torn her entire existence to shreds. The drive across the city felt like a surreal march toward the gallows. Crawford navigated her car through the decaying, abandoned streets of the industrial sector, where burnout streetlights cast long shadows over rusted shipping containers. She parked outside a massive, decaying warehouse that loomed like a rotting behemoth against the starless sky. The freezing wind howled through the shattered high windows, sounding like the desperate screams of forgotten souls. She pushed the heavy corrugated metal door open, her expensive leather boots clicking loudly against the cracked concrete floor. The interior was a vast cavern of pitch-black darkness, illuminated only by a single, swaying industrial bulb hanging from the vaulted ceiling. Crawford walked slowly into the center of the harsh circle of yellow light, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She stood completely alone in the deafening silence, waiting for the executioner to finally step out of the shadows. Then she heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps echoing from the deepest corner of the warehouse. Piper Blackwell stepped into the dim edge of the light, and Crawford felt the last remnants of her arrogant pride instantly vaporize. He was no longer wearing the mask of a concerned, wealthy father from the elite academy. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the very darkness of the room, radiating a cold, lethal aura that suffocated the air in her lungs. He stopped just a few feet away, his dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy, pity, or basic human warmth. This was the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, a man who commanded an empire built on blood and absolute obedience. Crawford looked into his eyes and saw the terrifying, unyielding void of a true apex predator. She realized with sickening clarity that the school board had never stood a chance against a monster of this magnitude. Kieran did not yell or raise his voice, but his words sliced through the freezing air like a finely sharpened blade. He told her she was a pathetic, disgusting coward who built her entire career on crushing children she believed were too poor to fight back. He meticulously detailed every single mechanic of his vast, impenetrable empire, ensuring she understood exactly how utterly insignificant she truly was. He explained that he controlled the ports, the unions, and the very politicians who had once promised to protect her wealthy institution. He told her that he could snap his fingers and erase her from the face of the earth without leaving a single drop of blood or a shred of evidence behind. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper that made her knees buckle. He dismantled her elitist delusions piece by piece, exposing her as a fragile bully who only attacked when she was hiding behind a wall of billionaires. Crawford sank to the freezing concrete floor, her body trembling violently as the sheer, crushing weight of his power pressed down on her chest. She wept openly, begging for a swift end to the agonizing torment that had consumed her life. She was entirely broken, stripped of her career, her marriage, and her dignity, completely surrendered to the mercy of a man who possessed none. Kieran looked down at the sobbing woman with absolute disgust, his cold mind calculating the final, devastating blow he was about to deliver. The cold, suffocating silence of the warehouse was heavy with the promise of death. Piper Blackwell stood over the sobbing woman with his jaw clenched and his dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy. He was no longer a father defending his child, but an apex predator preparing to erase a threat from existence. His hand slipped beneath his tailored suit jacket, his fingers brushing the cold steel rusting at his hip. He had killed men for far less than what Janet Crawford had done, and disposing of her body would require nothing more than a single phone call. Crawford squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her face against the freezing concrete, fully expecting her arrogant life to end in this rotting industrial tomb. But before Kieran could draw his weapon and cross that lethal, irreversible line, the heavy echo of footsteps rang out through the vast cavern. The sound was not the heavy, calculated tread of his armed lieutenants, but the light, familiar steps of a woman and a child. Kieran froze completely as two figures stepped out of the suffocating darkness and into the harsh circle of yellow light. Elise Dawson and 10-year-old Piper stood hand in hand against the freezing draft of the abandoned warehouse. Piper released her mother's grip and stepped forward until she stood directly between the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago and the broken teacher bleeding on the floor. She looked up at her father with bright, unwavering eyes that held a maturity far beyond her young age. She placed her small hand against his rigid chest and spoke in a clear, incredibly calm voice that echoed through the industrial silence. She told her dad to step back and let her handle this her own way. The absolute king of the Chicago underworld, a man who commanded an army of ruthless killers with an iron fist, instantly surrendered to the gentle command of a child. Kieran released a heavy, shuddering breath, dropping his hand from his weapon and stepping backward into the shadows. He yielded completely to his daughter because his love for her was the only force on earth more powerful than his rage. The lethal, suffocating tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a profound, reverent silence. With the immediate threat of violence subdued, Elise walked slowly toward the trembling woman curled on the concrete. She did not raise her hand to strike Crawford, nor did she scream or curse like a typical angry parent. She simply looked down at the ruined, pathetic shell of the elite educator with the unyielding, terrifying pride of a mother who had survived the absolute worst of the gutters. She spoke in a low, perfectly controlled voice that carried the heavy weight of 1,000 freezing nights slept in a rusted car. She told Crawford that she had judged a 10-year-old girl by the faded seams of her clothing and deemed her worthless trash. She explained that true worth was never bought with a $70,000 tuition or a pristine suburban house. It was forged in the blinding fire of absolute desperation, sewn together with bleeding fingers under the dim light of a broken street lamp. Elise crouched down until she was at eye level with the sobbing, terrified woman. She forced Crawford to look at her scarred hands, the same hands that had washed diner dishes for 14 hours a day just to buy baby formula. She systematically stripped away the very last of Crawford's arrogant, elitist illusions with the undeniable truth of real survival. She told the broken teacher that she had spent her entire life hiding behind the massive wealth of billionaires because she was too cowardly to face the real world. Elise declared that the $3 denim jacket Crawford had so gleefully sliced apart held more genuine love and profound resilience than her entire hollow existence. Crawford could not look away from the blazing, untamed fire burning in the mother's eyes, finally realizing the true, colossal magnitude of her own pathetic weakness. She had tried to break a family she believed was fragile and poor, only to discover they were forged from an unbreakable steel she could never comprehend. Elise stood back up with absolute dignity, leaving the weeping woman utterly defenseless against the crushing, humiliating truth of her own cowardice. Piper Blackwell stepped forward and left the protective shadow of her parents. She stood completely alone in the center of the harsh yellow light. She was only 10 years old, but she carried the heavy, quiet dignity of someone who had survived far worse than a cruel teacher. The pale purple bruise on her left cheek was still clearly visible under the glaring industrial bolt. It was a physical reminder of the violence Janet Crawford had so gleefully inflicted just days ago. Crawford looked up from the freezing concrete floor with wide, terrified eyes. She fully expected the little girl to scream at her or demand a brutal punishment from her Mafia father. She expected the Blackwell family to unleash the final, lethal blow that would end her miserable existence. But Piper did not clench her fists or raise her voice in anger. She simply looked down at the pathetic, broken woman with an expression of profound, unshakable calm. That quiet, steady stare was infinitely heavier than any weapon Karen Blackwell could have ever drawn from his coat. Piper looked at the trembling woman and spoke in a voice that was perfectly steady and clear. "You slapped my face in front of 30 children," she said, her words echoing softly against the rusted steel walls. "You took the only thing I had from the days when my mother and I slept in a freezing car. You cut it into pieces because you thought we were nothing but invisible trash." Crawford flinched violently as every single word struck her chest like a physical blow. She could not hide from the absolute, undeniable truth spoken by an innocent child. "You stood in front of my friends and smiled while you tore my world apart," Piper continued, her dark eyes shining but refusing to spill a single tear. "I went home that night and cried until I could not breathe. I asked my mother why you hated me so much. I asked her if her home was really a slum like you said. I am only 10 years old, Miss Crawford. I am only 10, and you made me feel like I did not deserve to exist." The devastating honesty of the little girl hung heavy in the freezing air, stripping away the very last defensive layers of Crawford's arrogant pride. The entire warehouse fell into a suffocating, breathless silence. Kieran stood in the shadows with his fists clenched tightly at his sides, ready to step in if his daughter needed him. But Piper did not need her father's violent underworld empire to fight this battle. She took one step closer to the weeping teacher and delivered a blow that no amount of money or power could ever match. "I forgive you," Piper said, the 3 simple words ringing out with the terrifying force of a thunderclap. Crawford gasped violently, her tear-filled eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing shock. "I do not forgive you because you deserve it," Piper explained, her young voice carrying the immense weight of a seasoned survivor. "What you did was cruel, and it still hurts me right now. But I forgive you because I deserve absolute peace. I refuse to carry your toxic anger inside my heart for the rest of my life. I refuse to grow up and think of your scissors every single time I look at my mother's jacket. I choose to remember my mother's love, and I choose to let you go." The profound, unmerited grace hit Janet Crawford with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The 48-year-old woman stared at the 10-year-old child and finally saw the colossal magnitude of her own absolute monstrosity. She had spent 5 years meticulously breaking innocent children to build her own pathetic kingdom of power. Yet this little girl, the very child she had deemed worthless, possessed a towering strength and an emotional maturity that Crawford could never even begin to comprehend. She realized she had been nothing but a miserable parasite feeding on the most vulnerable souls in the city. The forgiveness did not heal her broken pride, but instead burned like absolute fire against her guilty conscience. The sheer weight of that undeserved grace shattered the final, brittle remnants of Crawford's ego into a million jagged pieces. She collapsed entirely against the freezing concrete floor, burying her face in her trembling hands. She began to sob uncontrollably, her desperate wails echoing through the vast, empty cavern of the industrial warehouse. She cried not out of fear for her life or the loss of her wealthy career, but out of a pure, agonizing realization of her own wretched soul. She had been utterly defeated not by the ruthless violence of a mafia boss, but by the magnificent, shining resilience of a poor child. Kieran Blackwell watched his daughter from the darkest edges of the warehouse, and a profound realization washed over his hardened soul. The most feared man in the Chicago underworld felt his eyes burn with sudden, unshed tears. He had spent his entire life mastering the dark art of total destruction, believing that violent vengeance was the only way to protect his family. But standing under that swaying yellow bulb, Piper had just taught him that true, undeniable power did not lie in breaking an enemy. Real strength lived in the terrifying, beautiful ability to release them and walk away. He realized with a staggering sense of awe that his 10-year-old daughter was infinitely stronger than he would ever be. Elise stepped forward and gently wrapped her hand around Kieran's arm, silently anchoring him and pulling him back from the violent edge he had almost crossed. Piper turned her back on the sobbing, broken teacher and walked calmly toward her parents. She took her mother's hand and looked up at her father with a soft, genuine smile. "Let us go home, Dad," she whispered quietly in the dark. The three of them turned and walked out into the freezing Chicago night, leaving Janet Crawford completely alone on the cold concrete to face the agonizing ruins of her own shattered conscience. Janet Crawford signed away her teaching license forever the very next morning. She did not fight the educational board or hire a new lawyer because she finally understood she deserved to lose everything. She finalized her bitter divorce in absolute silence and packed her remaining clothes into 2 small suitcases. Then she moved to a tiny, run-down apartment in a completely different state to live out her days in quiet repentance. She spent her lonely nights staring at the peeling wallpaper and remembering the incredible, terrifying grace of a 10-year-old girl. Meanwhile, the 15 marginalized families she had tormented woke up to a miracle they could never have imagined. Massive, anonymous trust funds containing exactly $1 million were deposited directly into their bank accounts. The money completely erased their suffocating debts and secured a pristine, unbreakable future for every single abused child. Kieran Blackwell never once claimed credit for the colossal financial gift. He simply watched from the shadows of his vast empire and knew that true power was not just destroying monsters, but healing the innocent people they had broken. Back at the luxurious penthouse, Elise Dawson sat alone at the kitchen table under the warm, amber glow of the pendant lights. She laid the 2 severed pieces of the $3 denim jacket carefully on the polished marble surface. She refused to throw the ruined fabric away because it represented the absolute darkest, most desperate days of their survival. She did not try to hide the violent cut Crawford had made with her cruel scissors. Instead of using matching blue thread to camouflage the damage, Elise pulled out a spool of bright, thick white thread. She pushed the needle through the heavy denim, her hands moving with the steady, unyielding rhythm of a mother mending her family's heart. She sewed the pieces back together, intentionally leaving a highly visible, undeniable white scar running straight down the back of the jacket. The brilliant white stitches stood out like a physical declaration of their absolute resilience. She smiled as she tied off the final knot, knowing that a scar was never something to hide in shame. It was simply the beautiful, undeniable proof that you had survived the absolute worst and lived to tell the tale. Piper Blackwell transferred to a vibrant new public school the very next week, far away from the toxic elitism of the wealthy academy. She walked through the front doors proudly wearing the faded denim jacket with the bright white scar running down the center. When the other children asked her about the strange stitches, she simply smiled with the warmth of a girl who knew exactly what she was worth. She told them it was a beautiful badge of honor her mother had made, a symbol that genuine love and resilience will always outlast cruelty. Piper's journey is a powerful reminder that human worth is never measured by a heavy price tag or a pristine background. It teaches us that the darkest pasts can forge the strongest armor, and that true strength is always found in the incredible power of forgiveness. Here at Sunni Romance, We believe that every broken piece can be stitched back together if you have enough love and courage. We hope this intense story touched your heart and reminded you that your deep scars are just proof of your fierce survival. How do you find the strength to forgive the people who have hurt you the most in this life? Share your deepest thoughts in the comments below, and please subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more emotional stories every single day. We wish you peace, healing, and a beautiful life filled with unbreakable love until we meet again in the next video.